35,000 years ago, Europe looked extremely different to how it does today. Virtually all of northern Europe was covered in glaciers. Huge beasts roamed the land, from mammoths with 4-meter tusks to the shaggiest of shaggy rhinos, and prides of cave-dwelling lions that stalked them both. And as I'm sure you can guess, it was bloody cold too. About 3,000 to 4,000 years prior to this, colossal pieces of ice had broken away from the Arctic, known as a Heinrich event. This dramatically cooled the climate. Forests shrank, steppe and tundra expanded. Perhaps connected to this, the Neanderthals, who had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, were by this point no more. They had been replaced or entirely assimilated into groups of Homo sapiens, who had arrived in the continent about 10,000 years earlier.
It's these early groups of humans that I want to talk about today, these pioneers that spread across the landscape. We know them as the Aurignacian culture or Proto-Aurignacian culture, after the Aurignac cave in France where they were first discovered. Mon Dieu, sacré bleu. Forgive the French vibes today. What can archaeology tell us about the lives of these people who lived in a landscape so unfamiliar to us, who led a life so different to ours? I mean, a Europe with no British tourists. Must be heaven, so peaceful.
Before we get too deep into the weeds, it's important to note that this Aurignacian culture was almost certainly not the very first arrival of Homo sapiens into the continent. At Apodema Cave in modern-day Greece, a possible Homo sapien cranium was found and dates to an astonishingly old 210,000 years ago. This skull may well represent our species' earliest attempts at migrating out of Africa. Another early example of humans entering Europe was found at Bacho-Kiro Cave in Bulgaria, which is possibly as old as 47,000 years ago, but belongs to a technological tradition called the Initial Upper Paleolithic, not the Aurignacian. The point is, humans may have been periodically tinkering around the edges of the continent for a long time, but it seems that none of these earlier expansions were permanent. It wasn't until around 45,000 years ago that Proto-Aurignacian groups start to appear in the archaeological record. Just as I'm editing this absolute emotional rollercoaster of a video, another paper is released talking about the arrival of Aurignacian people in Europe. And it basically pushes back the date of the arrival of Aurignacian people in Portugal in the far west of Europe by 5,000 years. So keep in mind, when we're talking about prehistory, things can change very quickly. A lot of these Aurignacian sites, there aren't human remains, we're just going off tools. It can be kind of hard to find those and interpret them. You know, it's entirely possible that not only were other techno-complexes, other cultures arriving in Europe at a very early date, like the Initial Upper Paleolithic at Bacho-Kiro Cave, but that also the Aurignacian might have arrived in Europe earlier than we currently realize. So things always change. I try my best to keep up, but that's what makes archaeology so interesting, isn't it? Back to the studio. As for where these Aurignacian people came from, we're not 100% sure. They probably expanded out from the Levant, where we find similar tools dated to the same time period, but it's also possible this culture developed in what are now Iran's Zagros Mountains. It's hard to say for sure because we're linking sites based on similarities in the stone tools that these people left behind. Differences can be subtle, and it's hard to draw definitive conclusions, basically. As for how many people lived in Europe during this time, it's also very hard to say, and again, is far from an exact science. One study of sites in Western and Central Europe estimates there may have only been around 1,500 people spread across this vast area. These 1,500 were highly mobile though. Raw materials for stone tools were transported for several hundred kilometers. Different groups would have been in contact with each other, at least periodically, perhaps meeting at special times of year for friendship, feasting, and of course,
fishing.
The environment that they'd have lived in would probably be much more similar to where I am today. Even though this is the sort of high desert, not tundra, even though this is North America, not Europe, the landscape would have lacked a lot of tree cover. It really would have been very dry, very arid, and features in the landscape like this, river valleys, valleys of all sorts, anything that channeled game into one focused location would have been a very popular place to live for these people who entirely depended upon hunting herds of animals, following herds of animals. These people that lived in it all year round would have been intimately familiar with all the plants, all the huge animals that roam this landscape, every turn of the river, every rock. Well, maybe not every rock, there's probably a lot of rocks. But you get what I'm trying to say. It really is hard for us in our modern world to imagine how intimately familiar they were with just living out in nature. Incroyable. Petite Provence.
Tools, tools, tools. We have to mention them because so often in prehistory it's literally all we have to go by. One of the stools that really defines this period of European history are these small bladelets, about 5 centimeters or so in length. Archaeologists believe they formed part of composite weapons. This highly adaptable toolkit was a new invention at the time. These bladelets really were cutting-edge stuff, if you'll forgive the pun, and is in contrast to the level war points which are common from earlier in prehistory and from Neanderthal sites. Speaking of innovations again, one of the biggest differences between humans and Neanderthals is the ubiquitous use of bone and antler tools. Not that Neanderthals never used them, but for Homo sapiens, for us humans, it was an extremely common item. These actually increased in frequency after the Heinrich event at 40,000 years ago, which has led to a lot of head scratching as to why. Were humans following herds more? Did they find it easier to access bone than flint? We don't have a good answer to that question at the moment. Each part of the animal was generally used for different purposes. Antler, particularly reindeer antler, was made into weapons. Points with a split base for hafting are common for the era. These points are not thought to have been arrowheads though, more likely they were attached to throwing spears. Just as I'm about to release this video, everyone, Dr. James Dilley here, an absolute expert on prehistoric tools, maker of a brilliant YouTube series called Nap Time, the founder of ancientcraft.co.uk, where you can find beasts like this Mesolithic axe he made for me at the most reasonable rate in town. Dr. Dilley here had finished some research on these Aurignacian split-base points, and he's willing to hop on and share his knowledge with us. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Dilley.
That's quite all right. I feel like this is going to be the Viva exam No. 2. Contextualize the Aurignacian for us. Tell us about your research.
Yeah.
So be kind. Be kind.
Oh no, it's super easy. I only have one question. It just strikes me as someone who isn't familiar with prehistoric tools that making something from antler would not be that sharp, and it would be quite a difficult weapon to use, and not as good as a stone tool, perhaps.
Well, that's exactly why the PhD thesis came to be. Why would you use a piece of antler when, during the Mysterium beforehand, Neanderthals were using Levallois stone points, and after the Aurignacian in the Gravettian, they were using stone points again. They do use osseous points again, made of bone and antler here and there, but in the Aurignacian, they like their antler points. To set the scene, I guess, of the Aurignacian, my PhD mainly focused on Northwest Europe, but looked at a much broader landscape as well, because there isn't a great deal of Aurignacian archaeology from the Northwest, so I had to look at a broader picture of things. But it would have been really cold. we think of central France today, certainly Europeans think of central France. Well, I'll narrow that down a bit more. Brits think of central France for a holiday destination, thinking, oh yeah, nice and warm, wine, perfect. During the Aurignacian, the average July temperature would have been 5 degrees Celsius. So that, cold in July.
Yeah.
So January, December, that would have been really cold. So it pretty much would have been either boreal or Arctic tundra, lots of grassland, very, very few trees. And that is the key, really, few trees. If you've got very few trees that can either be burnt or used for timber for shelters or for spear shafts, you certainly wouldn't have had things like hazel or ash that you think of those classic spear shaft wood species that are really nice and light, they're flexible, perfect. Wouldn't have grown in those environments. It was too cold, there wasn't a long enough growing season, wasn't enough soil, too much permafrost. You wouldn't have got those species. What you would have had is things like pine, larch, and silver birch, and that's about it, really. So, is there a connection between the spearhead and the spear shaft? Why have antler? Well, let's look at the antler tips, I suppose. And for those early Aurignacian spear tips, they're not just a simple spear tip that you fit into a notch or a split in the wood. The split or notch is actually in the point. It's a split-based antler point. And that's the interesting thing, because you don't see anything like that apart from these early Aurignacian points. So the weakness changes position, because classically you'd have your spear shaft with the notch to fit the stone point or the antler point. But in this case, the split is in the spear tip, whereas the piece of wood, your shaft, is just beveled. So the weakness is in the spear tip. And as they were hunting reindeer, and reindeer would be dropping their antlers, the raw material is all around. But by changing the split and actually putting what we would consider later as a socket, like a socketed spear, is actually in the spearhead. So that the spear shaft doesn't have that weakness. It's got a much greater chance of not splitting, not breaking, because it's the valuable part.
So really, you think it's a technique for just preserving wood?
Yeah.
Almost like, the point would split off in the animal and the spear would be perfectly okay to use as another weapon, as that was so hard to obtain as opposed to the antler.
Yeah, definitely. And you could use that in a variety of hunting scenarios as well. You can either just be throwing these spears, going for pot shots, or if you're corralling reindeer into an enclosure, you could just be ramming those points in as deep as they go, pulling the spear shaft out, the point is still in there, and just easily attaching another one, going to hit another animal. There are various ways you can go about it.
Well, I almost want to say a semi-automatic spear as a result of that.
Lethal weapon. The suggestion, the margin for a fatal wound for large herbivores is around 20 centimeters or so.
Quite deep.
That's pretty deep. I mean, that's for people who are still working in Imperial, and that's what.
Don't even get me started on that.
Yeah,
I live in America.
Yeah, that's 8 inches. 8 inches. That is a really deep wound. Really weird thing was that for a couple of the videos is that once the hammer had dropped, which was the holding device for these short spears, is that they punched through the ballistics gel, and quite frequently the hammer would then be drawn up for the next shot, and the spear shaft would still be in place, but the antler spear tip was still wedged in the ballistics gel. And with that very tough split-based point, it was keeping the wound channel open like a splint. So the blood loss would have been massively increased, because if you put a projectile that's got a shaft in it, it will just plug the wound behind it. It's only when you pull it out that it starts to cause blood loss trauma. But if you've got this thing wedged deeply with it splinted open, you hit a vital, or grazed an artery or something, this animal is going to be going down in a matter of seconds.
Fascinating stuff. You really have put the icing on my cake to this video. It couldn't have been more perfectly timed. Everyone, as I said, should follow Dr. James Dilley on Twitter, visit his YouTube channel, and more importantly, buy these brilliant replicas on ancientcraft.co.uk. All of this information is going to be pinned down below. And yeah, thank you so much.
That's quite right.
Ivory was most commonly used for decorative items like beads or incredibly detailed figurines, which we'll come to later. Spoiler alert, the art from this period is incroyable. Lastly, bone was ordinarily used for more domestic tools, like needles. It's entirely possible that these tools were simply picked for these jobs based on their fundamental physical characteristics. Antler is the most resistant to impact, so of course would make the best weapons. Now, I know everyone always laughs at archaeologists for overemphasizing ritual, but we can't rule out that these choices may have had a symbolic aspect to them as well. For example, was it significant to these hunters that they were using antler, which reindeers use in combat, as a weapon to kill reindeer? It's certainly possible, entirely possible. Humans are fantastic at creating symbolic connections like that. One tool that has generated more debate than others, though, are the enigmatic perforated batons. The typical baton consists of one, sometimes two holes drilled through an antler, with edges and grooves often scratched along a shaft, sometimes around the hole as well. They can also occasionally be richly decorated. When they were first reported on in 1867, it was believed they were some sort of badge of office, perhaps like a bishop's staff, and were given the name batons de commande. But that interpretation has fallen out of favor. To be perfectly honest, we don't know what they were used for. Interpretations range from spear straighteners to atlatls and loads more besides. But in researching this video, I did read a very interesting paper. The authors of the paper analysed perforated batons from Gough's cave in Britain's
Somerset,
and wondered if the design features we see on perforated batons are connected in some way to their use with ropes. As evidence for this, they showed that the batons have a lot of wear around the perforation, likely caused by an elongated object passing through it. Double fractures on the antler suggest that they were put under substantial force. Probably much more force than could have been sustained by holding it in the hand. It would have just been yanked out of the hand before it snapped like that. And the bands of incisions made along the shaft may have been connected to the coiling of rope or improving the grip. They hypothesized that it could have been used as some form of peg, perhaps, to support shelters, or maybe suspend meat away from predators. Who knows? Maybe even as part of a harness, or in some way like a sledge guide. As I said, we don't know what they were used for.
If, like me, you're a wizard of the arts of bushcraft, an absolute bushcraft master, then you can probably think of 1,000 reasons why someone would want a peg and rope. The possibilities are endless. Whatever it was used for, it clearly was extremely important to Paleolithic people in Europe because they're found at the start of the Upper Paleolithic and the Aurignacian period, all the way through to the Mesolithic period, which is a span of at least 15,000 years. For me personally, that totally rules out any ritual significance in this object. Not that they probably didn't have a clear separation of day-to-day use and ritual use, but the primary function of this object could not have been ritual. No ritual survives 15,000 years. Except the ritual of bushcraft. Omelette du fromage!
When we think of the Ice Age, we think of mammoths. That's the first animal that springs to mind, usually, I'm sure. So you might think that Aurignacian people were chomping on mammoth steaks every single night, but evidence suggests that this was not the case. In Western and Central Europe, it seems that you would have had a diet that was absolutely dominated by reindeer. Reindeer make up 91 to 99% of the faunal remains in 17% of French Aurignacian sites. Sorry, Rudolph, but you were on the menu in a big way. These early Europeans bloody loved eating you. What we don't know is why they became such reindeer hunting specialists. On the one hand, it could have been a deliberate strategy to hunt an animal that lived in large herds. You could probably kill many in one go. And they not only provided food, of course, but the materials needed for tools, clothing, shelter, bâtons de commande. On the other hand, as Europe lurched towards the last glacial maximum, Arctic environments were expanding, and temperate forests where animals like red deer lived, they were receding. So reindeer might have just been the most abundant animal for them to eat. Who knows, maybe a combination of both factors. As for Eastern Europe, the picture is a little different. The Aurignacian is harder to pin down once we start heading further east, especially once we start getting into Russia. The open landscape means that there are less obvious natural shelters, less caves, and therefore we probably don't see people returning to the exact same habitation spots year after year, generation after generation, millennia after millennia, like we do in the West. Still, there are sites in Crimea and also 20 sites dated to the Upper Paleolithic that have been found so far along the Don River. In contrast to Western Europeans' taste for reindeer, these prehistoric people seem to have preferred horse. Several sites show evidence for the mass butchering of entire bands of horses. At Kostenki 14, around 2,000 horse bones were recovered from a layer dated to between 34 and 32,000 years ago. This probably represents 11 to 16 individual horses. Now, you know it, I know it, we all know it. People do like to be beside the seaside. So what was life like at the coast? Short answer is, we don't know. I feel like I'm saying that a lot in this video. But we don't know that much, because as you can tell from the map, sea levels have risen substantially since then. In a few locations, though, we do get a glimpse of how life might have been. Mollusks may have made up a significant part of people's diets, probably not too surprising, after all they are very easy to collect, doesn't require any fishing ability. At El Cuco rock shelter in Cantabria, 860 shells were recovered, most of them limpets. We see this pattern repeated at other Aurignacian sites too. We don't have any great evidence for hunting of sea mammals or fish, but at El Pendo Cave, also in Cantabria, one single sperm whale tooth was recovered from Aurignacian levels. There are no human marks on it at all, so it's difficult to say how it got there. Somebody could have just found it walking along the beach and thought, by Jove, that's jolly interesting, I'm going to take it back to my cave. If we were to get a tad more speculative though, we know whales occasionally beach themselves, and a group of hunter-gatherers would, I imagine, not turn down such a bonanza. Who knows? Fun to speculate though. Despite the lack of evidence for mammoths and rhinos and things being on the menu, intriguingly, they do make up a very large part of the art from the time period. Sacre bleu. My words cannot do justice to the beauty of the cave paintings at Chauvet, France. Buried for 30,000 years due to the cave entrance collapsing, this almost perfectly preserved gallery of 420 individual motifs gives us an unparalleled window into the world of these Aurignacian people. There's really nothing else like it. Lions, deer, mammoths, rhinos, hyenas. Theirs was a wild world, absolutely teeming with magnificent animals. At Chauvet, the images are made using 3 different colors: red hematite, white limestone, and black charcoal. The charcoal is the only one that can be directly dated and gives us a range of between 39 and 33,000 years old. The white images are made by simply removing the clay deposits that have built up on the wall to reveal the white limestone underneath. My personal favorite is this little owl. Woohoo! Sometimes whole walls are scratched clean of clay to help the drawings of clay and hematite stand out. The red hematite is the favorite color for handprints and abstract shapes, though animals are also painted in red. The hematite was applied in a few different ways: spat on using some sort of pipe or maybe just their gob, drawn on with a finger, and intriguingly, maybe even brushed on. As you can see from a zoomed in section of this rhino, it looks like it was applied with a brush of some sort. It has those linear lines across it. The black charcoal images are probably the most famous though. Not only are they just beautiful illustrations of Ice Age animals, but together they form large, dramatic hunting scenes. And, you know, we probably shouldn't be surprised at all that the artists were so focused on depicting hunting. This was their life.
If we believe the parietal depictions, cave lions, the largest predator of the epoch, practiced coordinated hunts, and attacked large prey such as steppe bison and even woolly rhinoceroses. This beast of prey must have been simultaneously feared and admired by the humans who shared their territories. It is conceivable that this combination of fear and admiration inspired in these artists, themselves hunters, a certain fascination, and that they symbolically staged themselves in these scenes in the form of these big cats.
A few hundred miles to the east lies the Swabian Jura mountain ranges of southern Germany. Here we haven't found much cave art yet, but instead intricately carved ivory figurines. Lions, horses, waterbirds, the first Venus figurine, a pendant with a tiny mammoth, even a little hedgehog. But more famous and more incredible than all of these is definitely the Lion Man. I should say lion human, really. Many would argue that it's a guy, but I don't think that anyone can honestly say that it's not a woman. There's no identifiable ziti or zezette, so I think it's fair to leave its gender as an open question. Why was it made? Again, impossible to say for sure, but a reasonable guess is that it represents some sort of shaman, maybe. Clearly, the Aurignacian people had a fascination and respect of the lion. If they admired them as hunters, as illustrated by Chauvet, it's entirely reasonable to think some element of their religion or spirituality revolved around the lion too. You can so clearly imagine hunters sitting around a fire, trying to summon the spirit of a lion to bring them good fortune in an upcoming hunt. Or maybe even they feared them. Maybe the lion was a vengeful god. Maybe they were warding off the lions. These cave lions were absolute beasts after all, noticeably bigger than modern African lions. No doubt these Aurignacian folks occasionally became a meal for a pride of lions. Especially if European lions hunted at night like modern African lions do. A lonely human out at night would be easy prey indeed. Terrifying stuff. They must have had mythology and folklore around lions. I can't believe that they could not have. Ethnographically, we can see that modern humans that live alongside lions, such as the Maasai of East Africa, have complicated and profound relationships with them.
The lion hunt, or ulamayo, on the other hand, is also a social cultural practice, a means to constantly negotiate the human-lion relationship that is accompanied with strong and respectful sentiments.
The Maasai only feel this love and respect for the lion. Hyenas and other predators are regarded simply with disgust. Whatever rituals were being practiced, whatever they thought of lions, we can get an idea of the kind of music that the Lion Man would have listened to. So far, 8 flutes have been recovered from the Swabian Jura. Incredible stuff. This is the reason for the fluty vibes going on in today's video. This sort of music may have been familiar to Aurignacian people. It's incredible. I love it. We don't often get such detailed glimpses into the lives of prehistoric people, especially in the Paleolithic. It's incredible. Okay, quickly whilst I'm on the subject of expression, obviously another way humans express themselves is through their clothing. We all know that you can tell a lot about someone's class or ethnicity or religion or how much weed they smoked when they were a teenager from how they dress and how they present themselves. So, knowing that, can we look for patterns in jewelry of Aurignacian people to get a sense of how they divided themselves ethnically and maybe even linguistically? Well, the answer to that is a resounding maybe. Marianne van Heeren and Francesco de Erico, whose names are probably pronounced very differently to that, analyzed the different bead types found at 98 different Aurignacian sites spanning the continent. They believe that they have identified 3 distinct groups of people. Groups at either end of Europe do not use the same animal teeth and bones to produce jewelry, but both groups share overlap with those in between. This is despite the fact that sites span the same time frames and have the same animals available to them. It's sort of hard to explain, so let me give you an example. Fox teeth were used as beads in Germany, Belgium, and southwest France, but not in Italy, Greece, Spain, or Austria, despite the fact that foxes lived in all of these environments. Therefore, to use or not use fox teeth as decoration was a deliberate choice that may illustrate different ethnic or linguistic groups.
Is this study of jewelry an exact science? Definitely not. And no one is saying it is either, but when we're looking so far into the past, 35,000 years into the past, we have to get a little creative. Humans differentiate themselves by the clothes that they wear, by the jewelry that they wear, and we can see a pattern in the jewelry from the Aurignacian period. At least 3 groups, but probably their idea of ethnicity was much more complicated than that. Probably they had much more than 3 groups in their sort of ideas, their conceptualization. You know, you could look at me, how I'm dressed today. I look like a typical American, but I certainly don't consider myself one. Likewise, an Irish person would leave behind a similar material culture to me, similar clothing, similar jewelry, similar Bourbon biscuits, but they probably do not consider themselves ethnically the same as me either. So this is really complicated. It's not an exact science, but it's the best we can do without being able to ask them.
Unfortunately, life isn't all reindeer burgers and flute solos. At some point, these people must have come into conflict with each other. We don't have much evidence of it. The population being so small and spread out does not leave archaeologists much to go with, and probably resulted in less conflict than later periods like the Neolithic. The only example I could find from the Aurignacian period comes from Cioclovina in Romania. This individual most likely received 2 blows to the head with a club from a left-handed individual. Merde. Another stumbling block to our understanding is that Aurignacian people seemingly did not practice burial. From 33,000 years ago during the Gravettian period, burial becomes a lot more common, and we have all sorts of incredible evidence associated with that culture. During the Aurignacian, though, between 45 and 33,000 years ago, we have none. Whatever happened to you, however you died, it seems your friends and family would have disposed of you in a way that has left little archaeological trace. Presumably, excarnation was practiced. Your body would have been placed on the steppe, to be eaten by a lion perhaps. Who knows? Your journey to becoming a lion man completed.
Now, many of you might be thinking, why did I choose to present these Aurignacian people as having dark skin, and how do you, if you are a European, relate to them? Well, the answer to both those questions lie within our DNA. I am not even close to being an expert in that, or being able to present that information in a good way. Fortunately for us, a real expert, an expert who has actually studied the genetics of Ice Age Europeans, Dr. Cosimo Post, was willing to hop on the channel and share his expertise with us. So that video is released at the same time as this one, should be in the pinned comment in the description. You know where to look for these things, mon dieu. Well, that's the end of the video. I hope you learnt a little bit about the lives of our French named lion-loving, flute-playing, reindeer-eating ancestors. In honor of them, I would like to play a little tune for the outro, a little song I wrote. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my Patreons for the support, as always. Let's start that again. That was fucking awful.